Here we go. Okay, so welcome everybody. It's nice to have you here. Ilan, I sent you a link. Tell me if you got it as well to the source sheet. I'm sorry. Like I said, I just had a quick visit to the doctor today and wasn't able to get those printed out. As Rashmuli said moments ago, we're living in a time with questions of power. We're in the middle, of course. I'm competing with the Republican National Convention, in case you didn't and haven't heard that. There are a lot more people tuning in there, I understand. And thank you, that's very kind. But we're going to discuss tonight is what I call three wonderful Jewish kings. And we're going to break it up into three different sort of sections. The first section is, we'll call what was. The second section I'll call what might have been, or probably what wasn't. And the third section is what could have been. And we're to talk about three kings and decisions that they made about the Jewish people. And they were very significant, really very, very important decisions for the Jewish people at that time. And when we think about it, right, we know the names. We know Antiochus, and we know the Hamans, and right, we know the kings who persecuted the Jews, and we know the kings who went about and made life very difficult for the Jewish people. Right, we all know the line from the Fiddler on the Roof when the rabbi says, when they ask the rabbi, right, should we say a blessing for the czar? And he says, God should protect and keep the czar far, far away from here, right? So we know those, but now sometimes it's good to think about what kings did for us and how they helped us. And so if you have that source sheet, on the top of the page, I have a picture there of a clay cylinder. If you see that picture on the top of this, it's a picture of a cylinder that is from the British, well, it's not from the British Museum. The picture is from the British Museum. And it is an object that's held in the British Museum. I was in England for a day in November, about 9 months ago. And, you know, if you go to the British Museum ever and you're standing, maybe you can see over the throngs of people looking at the Rosetta Stone, which is probably the most important object there, the Magna Carta. But for Jews and for the Bible, in many ways, the most intriguing object is what's called the Cyrus cylinder. It's a clay cylinder, and I just wrote the description on the page there. The Cyrus cylinder, it's a clay cylinder of Babylonian account of the conquest of Babylon by Cyrus in 539, of his restoration to various temples of statues removed by Nabonidus, the previous king of Babylon, and of his own work at Babylon. The cylindrical form is typical of royal inscriptions of the late Babylonian period. The text shows that the cylinder was written to be buried in the foundations of the city walls of Babylon. It was deposited there after the capture of the city by Cyrus in 539 BC, and presumably written on his orders. And this is an object, you could see it if you have the picture of it. You could see that there's writing on it. Now, why do I start with that? Or what is so important? Why did when we went to the when we went to the British Museum in November, why did I tell my kids and my wife, this is the object we have to see? I mean, again, we saw the Rosetta Stone. So, right, you know, so why? Because the Cyrus cylinder is a very significant document. It's believed to be a very significant document in terms of human rights. And let's see why. And it's a very significant document also Judaically, possibly. So if you see under that paragraph where it has the number 12, and this is some of what's written in the Cyrus cylinder. He searched everywhere, and then he took a righteous king. This is talking about the king Marduk. You've probably heard the name Mordechai. Shh, don't tell anybody. Mordechai, Marduk, the Persian king. Shh, don't tell anybody. So he searched everywhere. He's talking about Marduk, and then he took a righteous king, his favorite, and he called out his name Cyrus. He pronounced his name as king all over the world. And then it continues. He ordered him, Marduk ordered Cyrus to go to the city Babylon. Cyrus was a Persian king. Babylon was the seat of the rule of the Babylonians. And so he tells him to go to Babylon. He set him there on the road to Babylon, and like a companion and friend, he went at his side. He made him enter his city Babylon without fighting a battle. He saved Babylon from hardship. He delivered Nabonidus, the king who did not revere him, into his hands. This is his description of what happened when he conquered Babylon. And I don't know if this is the only historical description of it, but it's understood historically that unlike most times in history, that when Cyrus and the Persians came to conquer Babylon, the Babylonians opened the gate for them and allowed them to come in and allowed them to conquer the city. Maybe they were not too happy with the royalty also. It was not something that happened with bloodshed. It was something that happened in a very easy and simple way, that they were allowed to take over. And so Cyrus writes this. He's describing what happens, and he goes on. And he says, and I just want to read to you, and if you want to see the full, there are tens or hundreds of websites online. You can just put in a Google search. You'll see hundreds of pictures of the same picture, and you'll see hundreds of websites where this Cyrus cylinder is translated. And here is some of the key parts. He says he was king, etc. And then he says as follows: I return the images of the gods who had resided there to their places, and let them dwell in eternal abodes. I gathered all of their inhabitants and returned them to their dwellings. And there are two things he says here that are significant. He goes in and he's allowing the rebuilding of temples and shrines, the returning of it. There was a pagan empire. Everybody basically was pagan back then, except for the Jews. They were polytheists. There were many gods. And he allows for the pagans, he allows the rebuilding of Marduk's temple, which he says that the Babylonian kings were not treated properly. And he allows inhabitants to return to their dwellings. People maybe who were pushed out, who were religious, who were part of these cult and temple worship, he allows them to come back. So it's seen as a very important document in terms of human rights and religious rights, because he is telling people, you can come back and you can worship your God. I'm not going to tell you otherwise, even though he is not Babylonian. This is Marduk, the Babylonian god. He is Persian. And he's saying, you guys can return to your homes. We are going to worship your gods again, even though in his presumably pantheon of different ancient gods and ancient religions, he had his own different gods that he worshipped. And so it's seen in that way. And this is believed to be, and we'll see in a few moments why, the foreign policy of Cyrus, which was a very good foreign policy. Cyrus was not like the Babylonians. He didn't say, place my idols in your temple and worship my gods. He said to them, worship what you want, you can imagine how it ends, just send me taxes, right? He said, I don't want trouble. I know how to remain. You can be happy. You do what you do. I'll do what I do. She does what she does. The most important thing is send me taxes and we'll all be happy, and my army will protect you from whatever heathens. And I don't know if he was the one who called himself Cyrus the Great, but he's known as Cyrus the Great, and he was the ruler of a vast empire. Now, why it's important Judaically is for a number of reasons. And to go back Judaically, on the next source on your page, I have a source from Daniel. And we'll see in this part of the class, we're going to look at some biblical sources. The Cyrus cylinder is an artifact from the biblical times. Cyrus, I should say, lived from approximately 600 to 530. The conquest of Babylon was in the year 539. Now, when Cyrus was first born as a young prince, the great empire of the time was the Babylonians. We're not too far away from the 3 weeks of Shivasar B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, the day of the destruction of the Jewish temple. Of course, the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. In 609, the Babylonians defeated the Assyrians and became sort of the great power of the world. And eventually, they come into Israel. And in the year 597, they remove the king of Israel and they replace him, and they bring many of the great Jews of Jerusalem back to Babylon. And that's described in the book of Daniel. I'm going to read a little bit from the Hebrew, a little bit from the English if you want to look at it. I apologize to Harold if I didn't see you trying to get in the waiting room. My apologies. But here is from the book of Daniel. Okay. Bishnat shlosh lemalchut Yehoyakim melech Yehuda ba Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel Yerushalayim v'yatzar aleh. So it's in the third year of King Yehoyakim that Nebuchadnezzar comes and he lays a siege to Jerusalem. And it says, what happens? Yehoyakim doesn't want trouble. So in verse 2, it says that Yehoyakim, what does he do? He gives him the gold, the silver, gives him whatever he wants. Smart guy. You are the mighty empire. We are the little mouse. We're not going to mess with you. You want gold, you want silver, take it, take what you want and leave us alone. He gives him the kalim, the vessels from the temple. And what happens, though, at the same time, is in verse 3, it says here, Vayomer Amelch Ashpenaz Rav Sarisav. So he says to one of his main officers, Ashpenaz, he says, Lahavibi b'nei Yisrael mizera mlucha min apartamim. Yiladim asher bein kol ma'um v'tovei mar'el, maskilim b'chol chachma v'yodei dat u'mavine mada, v'asher koach bahem la'amod b'eichal amelch la'amdeim sefer l'shon kastim. What does he say? He says, what we're doing is we're taking the king, we're taking many of the nobility. We're taking the people of potency, of power, of strength. And what are we going to do? We're going to bring them back to Babylon with us. He installs a puppet king in the year 597. A puppet king who he hopes won't rebel against him, who does rebel against him. And that's why 11 years later, the temple and Jerusalem is destroyed, razed completely. But his hope is not to do that. His hope is I'll install this puppet king. I'll take all the people of wealth, all the people of strength, all the people of charisma, all the people of power. I'll bring them back with me to Babylon and we won't have any trouble. And then what he does is he says, and I'm going to take now young Jewish from leading families and we're going to bring them to the palace. And we're going to teach them Babylonian. We're going to teach them our culture. We are going to forcibly assimilate them is what he's going to do. And amongst the people that he brings in, it says in this last verse, is amongst the people he brings are Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, the Azariah. Daniel is the one who this book is about. If you remember the, what's that movie, Coming to America? And the scenes with the Daniel in the lion's den, if you know what I'm talking about. I don't know if you guys know that, Coming to America, like you guys from the African continent, not the story of your lives. But the, right, he talks about Daniel in the lion's den, and that's what Daniel's most known for. But Daniel becomes the great, one of the greatest of the advisors of the kings of Babylon. In many ways, his book is compared to the story of Yosef, a Jew in exile who rises to great power. And in the last verse of the first chapter, it tells us, Vayi Daniel ad shnat achat lekoresh hamelech, that Daniel remains all the way into the time of King Cyrus. So Cyrus takes over for the Babylonians. The Babylonians have destroyed the temple in the year 586. In the year 539, here comes Cyrus. They come in, they come to Babylon, and they take over the empire. Now we know from the cylinder that Cyrus allows the Babylonians to go and to rebuild the temple. But it appears from another biblical source that it is not only the Babylonians who he allows to rebuild the temple. And this comes from the first chapter of the book of Ezra. Ezra is a very important scribe. Ezra is a very important Jewish teacher, and Ezra lives about 120 or so, 100 years after the rebuilding of the second temple. And Ezra talks about how it came about. And I'm just going to read to you or speak to you from the English of what it says in the book of Ezra. Ezra and Daniel are interesting books that part of them are in Hebrew and part of them are actually in Aramaic. Jews speak Aramaic during the second temple period. And the beginnings of the book start in Hebrew. And Ezra says as follows. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, when the word of God spoken by Jeremiah was fulfilled, what's it referring to there is that Jeremiah talks about 70 years of the kingdom of Babylon. And Babylon is a major kingdom from 609 until 539 when Cyrus and his men come in and take over their capital. It's also alluded to as 70 years, the belief of from the destruction of the first temple, 586, until the rebuilding the second temple, which we won't look at in the sources, which happens in the year of 516. But how does that come about? The Lord roused the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia to issue a proclamation throughout Israel by word of mouth and in writings as follows. Thus says King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and charged me with building him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Sounds a lot like what it says in the cylinder. Now, in the cylinder, it says, it's talking to the people of Babylon, and it's talking about their god, Marduk. But if this is being addressed to the Jewish community, it's not going to talk about Marduk, and especially if it is edited in some way by Ezra 100 plus years later, it's going to tell basically the same story, but with slight differences, which is what Ezra does here. And he tells the same story, and he says, any of you of his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem that is in Judah, and build the house of God of Israel, the God that is in Jerusalem. All those who stay behind, wherever he may be living, let the people of his place assist with silver, gold, livestock, besides the free will offerings to the house of God that is in Jerusalem. He tells the Jews, much like it says in the Cyrus cylinder, two things. You can rebuild your temple, and all of you who want to go back to Jerusalem, go back to Jerusalem. And so in many ways, it seems that the Cyrus cylinder demonstrates that what Ezra was saying was 100% true. And we know the Jews do go back. We know they build the temple. It is not so simple. They get to Israel in the book of Daniel, in the book at that time. It's described in the book of Ezra. They want to rebuild the temple. The Samaritans, we know as good Samaritans. The Jews didn't think at that time they were so good. They were quasi-Jews, and they have a similar religion to ours, which maybe we'll get back to a little bit later. They ask the Jews if they can help them rebuild the temple. And the Jews say, no. It's not your job to build the temple. It is our job. And it's not ours and yours. It is ours alone. The Samaritans get upset. They claim to the emperor, to Cyrus, that the Jews are trying to revolt. And Cyrus pulls back the permission. And for about 15 years, they are not allowed to rebuild the temple. And they are once again allowed to rebuild it in the year 516. Now, there are historians who have said, now, let me say something before that. Anything that has to do with history and the Bible is always in dispute, because you have people who say, look at this, it proves the Bible is true, whether it's true or not. And you have people who say, look at this, has nothing to do with the Bible, whether it's true or not, because it's, it's not about reality for many a historian coming from the wanting to prove the Bible is correct and what it says is true. And it's, it's a different story from those who want to say anything it says in the Bible, the Tanakh, whether it be the Old Testament or the New Testament, is not true. So those historians who say, oh, look at the Cyrus cylinder, it was found in the city walls of Babylon. It was left there, and it's the way it was written and the way similar cylinders in the ancient period in Babylon and Persia and other places, it was really addressed to the gods. So, Ezra just sort of made this up, and this is not a proof of the reality. And yes, of course, the Jews built a second temple. We know that, but this is, as who knows if this is true or not, has nothing to do with it. That's what some historians say. And again, a lot of it is bias. On the other hand, there are many who say 100% this is the case and blah, 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 blah. What's interesting is that later there were other stones that were found, and they're not in as good shape as the Cyrus cylinder, which was hidden underground, like your last will and testament that you dug in camp, 20 years ago, and you hid there, and 50 years in that sleepaway camp or at your school or wherever, they'll dig it up and they'll find whatever embarrassing pictures of you in your bat mitzvah dress or something, or your bar mitzvah suit or whatever it might be. It's not in as good shape, but they're on tablets that were found in other areas. And basically the writing is not the same because it's not as well preserved, but has the same basic message as the Cyrus cylinder. And so it appears, according to, I can't say the majority, it's very, very likely that what happened is Cyrus wrote, well, I don't know, he himself, the cylinder was written, he wrote a letter to the Jews. He wrote a letter to 50, 100, 200, who knows how many other governments and communities and religions all over his empire, saying to them what we said before. You want to worship your God? Gegas into hate. He spoke Yiddish. You want to worship your God? Go ahead. Whatever it is that he said, send me taxes. That's all I care about. And so Cyrus here, this is a very important, we'll call it a document, because it is a document that's written, even though it's on a cylinder. And in many ways, it demonstrates and shows a similarity to what's described in Ezra. Now, what's intriguing also about Cyrus is also mentioned in other books. Now, according to tradition, the book of Yeshaya is a great prophet of the Jewish people. He lives during the First Temple period. He lives well before the destruction of the first temple. He lives in the late 8th century, and he lives during the time period when the 10 tribes are exiled by the Assyrians. So that's before the rise of Babylon. And in the 44th chapter of the book of Yeshaya, Yeshaya says as follows, Ha'omer l'choresh ro'i v'chol chefzi yashlem v'leimor l'Yerushalayim tibaneh v'heichal tivased. What does he say? And I say about Cyrus, he is my shepherd, right? The Lord is my shepherd is what we say, right? To God, who is a ro'eh, who is the shepherd of God, Moses, Abraham. In Yeshaya, Cyrus is described as God's shepherd. Cyrus will be the one who will fulfill God's purposes and will save Jerusalem. Jerusalem will be rebuilt, and the temple you shall be founded again, which is quite a statement to make about somebody who hadn't yet been born. According to most academics and many others, Yeshaya is not one person who lives in the 8th century. The first 40 chapters are probably done in the 8th century, and the second half of the book is known as Deutero-Isaiah, although there's scholars today in the academic circles who talk about 2 different later Isaiahs or even 3 different later Isaiahs, that it's a composite, but it's something that comes later, and it's verses. It has to do with the language, and it's verses like this, that when it talks about somebody, Cyrus, how is Yeshaya just going to say this about Cyrus? The temple hasn't even been destroyed. The Assyrians haven't been defeated by the Babylonians. The Persians have not come in yet and defeated the Babylonians. And he's talking about this person, Korah. So you want to be a good believing Jew, Baruch Hashem, and you can say that this is a prediction for the future. And if you're more skeptical, you can say it was written later. And either way, it's okay. Whatever it is, in the Tanakh, we have descriptions of Koresh as being my shepherd. Now, if you want to go on Google later, you can look at it. There's a certain person who has been nominated for president of the United States. I believe it was officially yesterday. And if you go onto newspapers, you can Google it and search it. There's many newspapers that compare or call Donald Trump the Cyrus of the evangelicals. That they say we don't necessarily agree with his morals, the same way the Jews didn't necessarily agree with everything that Cyrus believed and stood for, but he is the champion of our cause. And so in many Christian communities where they know the Bible well, that is interestingly and fascinatingly, you can agree, you can disagree. We're certainly not going down the road of politics. It was just something that's worth mentioning, and you can go and look at it. But the idea of who Cyrus is, I'm saying to you because here we are, 2,500 years later, and Cyrus is still noted as a king who was great to the Jews, and thus the comparisons there from people. And that's the first part of our class. That's during the biblical period, and that's what I'll say we'll call what was. We'll turn to the Second Empire. If anybody has any questions, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and ask, or if you want to, you please at any time. The second we're going to call what wasn't. And the reason why what wasn't is that the second great king we're going to look at is also called the Great, Alexander. Okay, and Alexander is known as the Great. There's still many a Jew named Alexander. There's even a Hasidic dynasty, the Alexander Rebbe, right? And there are legends later on after the story that we're going to look at that say that for the year when this occurs, that all the Jewish boys who were born were named Alexander. The rabbis in the Talmud, Rav Alexandri. So Alexander is a common name. It's not a very Jewish name last time I checked. Alexander the Macedonian. We know who Alexander was. Alexander was, of course, the great leader. He's the one who defeats the Persians. He defeats Darius, not the Darius who gave the Jews permission to rebuild the temple, working off of Cyrus in the year 516, but much later, about 180 years later. And Darius is defeated by Alexander, and Alexander's empire is at that point basically the entire known world of Western Greek, and he is the beginning of really the great Greek Empire. Alexander was a great tactician. He was also a great scholar. He had a pretty good teacher. You've probably heard of him, Aristotle. Aristotle was his private tutor. So, he he had a good teacher. I don't know if Aristotle, some people are brilliant. There might not be good teachers. So I don't know if Aristotle was a good teacher. Not that I can't really comment about, to be honest, but certainly he was somebody who had a great wisdom to share, and Alexander learned from him. Alexander defeats the Greeks, and Alexander does come to Israel about 325 before the Common Era. He's in Tyre. He goes down, he destroys Gaza, and question about whether or not he goes to Jerusalem. In the Talmud and in Josephus, there are accounts of him going to Jerusalem. The accounts are very, very similar, but both the Talmud and Josephus are hundreds of years after that. Josephus lives during the 1st century, great Jewish general, later hangs out with the Romans and becomes the Roman historian and writes the antiquities of the Jews and the history of the Jews. But he's living 350, 400 years after Alexander would have come to Jerusalem. And similar, the Gemara, stories in the Gemara, at first is found in Masechet Tanit, which is a Mishnaic source, but we're talking 2nd, 3rd century, and we have it. The where I give it to you here is from the Gemara in Masechet Yoma. So if the first time we talked about from the Bible, a historical event, now we're going to talk about an event that the rabbis describe, which, at least in the way they describe it and based upon names and their different versions, didn't happen and probably didn't ever happen. But this is the way that it's described in the Gemara. And truth be told, that it's this interesting question historically, sort of like, does something have to be historically accurate or not to be part of our tradition and part of who we are? And if, like I said, there's a Jewish tradition that Alexander, and just generally Greek, we think about Hanukkah and Greek culture versus Jewish culture, but there are many statements in the Talmud in different places where Greek culture is greatly appreciated. For example, it talks about that you can read certain books in Greek, and it talks about how Greek can be will be the Greek Yavan will be ba'ohele shame. It will be in the tent of shame. It will be in the tent, not shame Shame, but shame, the ancestor of Abraham, and how there's a great reverence in many Jewish texts about Greek culture, the Greek mind, Greek wisdom, and a lot of it has to do with this idea of Alexander. So let's look a little bit of this. And this is the Talmud is talking about here how one of the dates that's mentioned in this ancient text, the Megillat Ta'anit, that describes events that happened, and some of them were holidays. Much of what happened then we no longer celebrate anymore. It's no longer part of the calendar. And one of them is the day that it says, the day that the Samaritans requested that Alexander destroy the temple. And that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to destroy the temple, according to the story, which wouldn't be a great shock. And it's interesting to think about this within the context of the story we just looked at of Cyrus, who the Samaritans, and we didn't look at the sources, but the Samaritans are the ones who complained. So here we have hundreds of years later, not that long, 180, 200 years later, and the Samaritans want to destroy the temple. It's this unfortunate thing that we know that oftentimes, if one person worships the moon and the other person worships a rock on the other side of the world, they can get along. But if you want to worship rocks that are 2 inches away from each other, then we're going to have trouble. So the Samaritans have a very similar religion to Judaism. It's an outgrowth of Judaism. They do a Paschal Lamb on Har Gerizim, Mount Gerizim. Fascinating thing to see if you're in Israel ever around Passover time. You can go and you can witness it. There are not that many of them left, but it's we're close, and because we're close, that is oftentimes the reason as to some of the difficulty. And we so there too. So we're going to snub them again. So what happens is Alexander gives them permission. And here's what the Talmud continues. And people came and told the high priest Shimon HaTzadik. This is some of the issues, is who exactly is told. Some of the sources say Shimon HaTzadik was the high priest. In other sources, it talks about the high priest being named Yehuda. What does he do? So Shimon HaTzadik, he goes and he puts on his priestly garments. He wraps himself in them. Now, just to note, very quickly, and you may know or you may not know, so excuse if you know, there are two different types of priestly garments. It's called in the Hebrew Big Day Kahuna. There are priestly garments that are all white, and those are worn by a regular Kohen. And then there are the priestly garments, which have all sorts of different colors there's lots of gold, and there's purples and blues and red. It's described in detail in the Torah. And those are colors which are not very common. They were the clothing of royalty, much as your son Shamir was saying to me when we met the other day outside the park that he was speaking about at Rodef not that long ago. And so we have the Kohen Gadol, when he would come out wearing the Urim V'Tumim, and he's got beautiful jewels and diamonds and gold and all sorts of different colors. It was quite the scene when he would come out. So he comes out, and he's only supposed to wear that in the temple. Here he is. He sees that this is an important moment, and he has to wear it outside the temple. And he goes in this beautiful clothing outside the temple. And we're told the nobles of the Jewish people were with him, and they all had torches. And all night they were walking and going until dawn, when they finally sort of gather together, and they run into they arrive, and they greet the Greeks, and they meet up with him, and they see each other, and the Samaritans say to the Greeks, "Who are these people?" "Those are the Jews who are rebelling against you. And look, here they are coming out to war with their fancy, general in his super fancy clothing, who fancies himself a god or whatever it is." And they reach Antipatris, and the sun is shining, and they see each other. And it says, when Alexander sees Shimon HaTzadik, he descends from his chariot and he bows down in front of him. Now, Alexander, I don't know the name. You can look it up in history. I forgot it. There was a name of his horse. He had some, gigantic horse. I don't think he was like a Napoleon and very small and had a complex and needed the biggest horse, but he sat on this big, huge horse. There are those who say he would have been like 10 feet into the air, sitting on top of his horse. And so for him to descend from his horse is a big deal. And he goes down and he bows. And his people, they turn to him, his escorts, and they say to him, "What are you doing bowing down?" And he says to them, "I do so because the image of this man's face is the victorious image I see on the battlefield," which is quite a statement. It may remind you of something else historically as well, which we'll get to in a little bit, that happens way after, hundreds of years after this event is purported to have happened. But he sees this, and as a result, he says to them, "Why'd you come?" And they said to him, "Is it possible that the temple and the house in which we pray for you and for your kingdom is going to be destroyed by the Gentiles? How could you allow such a thing to happen?" And he says that he was misled, and right away they go, and the Jews go, and they stab the Samaritans, and they kill them, and it doesn't end in a very, nice way. It ends in a very bloody way, and we can leave that out, as many stories do. And there's total destruction in Mount Gerizim, which is, of course, sort of the foil. You think of a story, and this is a story in the Talmud with all sorts of intriguing things that are given to it. Now, it's hard to believe that this story happens, because a few different things. In one version of this, there are different versions of the story that say different things. Some have different characters who are mentioned. Some of them have one version of the story. They come out and they show the book of Daniel. And in the end of the book of Daniel, much of the book is written in like we said, when Daniel lived, 500, 530, 550. There are allusions to later empires, and some talk about this great man on the horse, which seem to be allusions to Alexander. But much like when we talk about earlier, the book of Yeshaya, it's probably parts of the book of Daniel were written later. There are different sections of the book of Daniel, not for tonight. That goes well beyond what we want to talk about tonight. My apologies. So probably there are different versions. The story is probably not something that certainly didn't happen in the way that it happened. And the question is why is the story here? And what's the purpose of the story? What's the version of the story? And, when we think about Jews and Greeks, again, the first thing we think about is Hanukkah. And it's the Jews versus the Greek, right? It's the Greek body versus the Jewish mind, and the Jews who become Hellenists. But that's not the totality of who the Greeks were. And that's not the way the Jews want to present themselves to the Greeks. And for a couple of hundred years, I don't know if it's a couple of hundred, but at the beginning of the Greek Empire, the Jews had religious autonomy. They maybe didn't have political autonomy. They had religious autonomy. There was appreciation for Greek culture and the Greek mind and the Greek wisdom, but they were allowed to continue to be who they were. And it's a demonstration. And whether the story is true or not, we know that Alexander does not destroy the temple. We know that he does not place an idol in the temple. So whether it's this active thing that happens where we're telling a story that and if we think of, let's say there's a verse that we say in davening, Ele barecha ve'ele basusim va'anachnu b'shem Hashem Elokeinu nazkir. If you're familiar with that verse, it's from Psalms, they with their horses and they with their chariots, and how do we come and approach in war? We approach with the name of God. And this is a story that basically is saying the greatest warrior of all is coming to Jerusalem. And how is he defeated by the Jews? He's not defeated by our military might. He's defeated by honor, respect, kindness, religion. That's how he's defeated. He's defeated in those ways. And he's not really defeated, but in a sense that the military might doesn't come in and doesn't destroy the Jewish people. And so that's a lot of what's going on in the source of sort of saying, we started this way with the Greeks and they respected us, and maybe later on they didn't respect us. And it's a very intriguing sort of story. It's also a story for another, going beyond. I'll make one more comment, then I want to just go to the third king, which is an episode that's the least well known of the three, I believe, and therefore in many ways the most intriguing, is Judaism. Right? Judaism was a small religion, small group of people, and then all of a sudden the Greeks come with their culture. For a long time, Jews were right. It was Jews, and are you going to be idolaters or not? And idolatry, are we going to remain monotheistic, or are you going to remain Jewish? And then all of a sudden, you have a very different idea that Jews have to contend with, which is not idolatry, but Greek wisdom, which is not, this cultish worship, even though there are those components to it as well, but it really has great wisdom, great ideas. And all of a sudden things are very, very different, because all of a sudden the marketplace of ideas are open, and we can't say our ideas are better. We can't say that our morals are better. This is society we're building is better, because the Greeks are building with the aspects of a republic and democracy and their technology. And so also within this source is this whole question of how is Judaism going to, in a sense, stand up in the marketplace of ideas with the Greeks. And the way that this source is playing is, how are we going to stand and how are we going to be victorious? It's going to have to be through our religion. It's going to have to be with our great leaders. It's going to have to be with the high priest. That is the way that we will triumph. And so it's a source that has many ideas encapsulated with it. But that's the second king. I'll call it what wasn't. If you want to believe the story is true, you certainly can. I'm not trying to tell you not to. Sitting here 2,300 or so years later, it doesn't matter to me if the story is true. It's part of our tradition, and as far as I'm concerned, and therefore it is as true as the other ones in terms of its relevance to our people. Okay, that was the second story. And now we have the third historical event. And like I said, if at some point you want to unmute yourself and you want to ask a question, please at any time. And this is called What Might Have Been. And if you see the picture there, that is a picture of a letter. If you grew up in Greece and I didn't know it, or it's not in Greek, it's in Latin. If you speak a good Latin, this is a letter that was written by the Emperor Julian to the Jewish Patriarchate in the year 362. So we're talking right about 675 years later. And before we read the letter, let me just tell you about Julian. So Julian is the emperor of Rome. He's only the emperor of Rome for a short period of time, from the years approximately 361 to 363. Now, before 361, about 45 years or so before that, 49 years before that, the year is at 312, that it's reported that Constantine says he sees the cross in the sky when he goes to battle, and he questions historically, but let's just say he allows Christianity to be a state-sponsored religion. of Rome. There are different debate questions as to exactly what it meant and what it is, and is it official, is it unofficial, is it the only one? Okay, that's beyond our scope. Constantine converts. All of his family become Christians. He's got lots of sons who are named Constantine, Constantinus, Constantine, etc. He's got a nephew whose name, we'll call him Julian. That wasn't his full name, but that's how he's known.
Converts from what?
He's a pagan.
He's just a pagan.
He's a pagan. He's not, that's a good question. I don't know what the conversion process was. I assume there was, I don't know. I don't know if there was baptism. I don't know when that starts, but he was a pagan. He didn't have a specific religion. I assume to just take on other pagan gods, you don't have to convert, but to become a Christian or a Jew, there is some, I don't know what the ceremony was. I have this funny story. I was last year speaking in the synagogue I work with in San Diego. So on Erev Yom Kippur, there's a custom of many to go and to go to the mikvah. And so in the short period of time that I had at San Diego, I drove to the beach, left my bathing suit on. It's okay. And I went in and my wife said, the water's so cold. You're not going to go in. And I went in and you got to really walk far and I'm cold. It's not like a river in Colorado in August. Okay. Don't worry that much. Maybe it's like the rivers in Arizona in August, but and I went in and I dunked in the mikvah. I'm ready for Yom Kippur. And as I'm walking back, my wife says, look over there. And there seemed to have been a number of baptisms that were going on, which was fascinating. We didn't go and ask them, but I was wondering if it was happening. It had to do that they were doing it purposely right before Yom Kippur. I have no idea. I don't know. I have no idea. I should have asked them. And then, I guess the story is better with the intrigue, with the lack of knowledge at the end than it would be if I knew one way or the other. So either way, it was an interesting thing that happens. So I don't know how, but somehow they convert and they all become Christian. Julian, there were many times, different times we discussed the book of Ruth, and we can talk about how you become king in the ancient period. And we know a lot of it is there's a lot of death, there's a lot of regicide, there's a lot of killing of nephews and killing of brothers and basically everybody, for the most part, in Constantine's family is killed so different people can have succession and become king. In 361, Julian is made, and his uncle there, Constantine, is long dead. He's made Caesar, which is not empire. He's a great warrior in Gaul and in other places. That's I think in 350 and 361. His cousin, the emperor dies, I believe, and he becomes emperor in 361. Julian, although he was converted and a young man, a Christian like his uncle and his family, and that's what you do, he got a very great Greek education. The sort of Aristotelian, Socrates, sort of Greek, Latin education. And he said, I want to restore. Now, by this time, 360s, the Roman Empire was in decline. It was no longer, maybe old roads still led to Rome. But the barbarians were at the gate, and the empire was no longer what it once was. It wasn't anymore. And and there are different reasons, but he wants to restore the empire. And part of the way that he believes from his education to restore the empire is to bring back the paganism, to bring back the cults of sacrifice. And with that, he believes that the Roman Empire, which Constantine had sort of set on the wrong course by joining Christianity, that will be a way of bringing back. There are debates amongst historians for hundreds of years as to exactly, does he hate Christians? Does he not hate Christians? But he wants to bring back, he believes he can bring back the greatness of the Roman Empire through bringing back paganism and cult sacrifice and polytheism, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things he does, and one of the sources that we have, and that's what this letter is the letter that he wrote to the Jews. And I just want to read it to you. And it's, again, an amazing artifact of history. This is a letter that was written to the Jews, I believe, in the year 361. And it's written to the community of the Jews. I believe it's in Latin. It would make sense to me that it was Latin. I apologize. I assume so. No, we know e pluribus unum, right? Don't we know that? Is it unum or unum, right? So we know that. So there we go. We all know 10 words. So He writes this to the Jews. In times past, by far the most burdensome thing in the yoke of your slavery has been the fact that you were subject to unauthorized ordinances and had to contribute an untold amount of money to the accounts of the treasury. Of this I used to see many instances with my own eyes, and I've learned of more by finding the records which are preserved against you. Moreover, when a tax was about to be levied on you, again I prevented and compelled the impiety of such obloquy to cease here, and I threw into the fire the records against you that were stored in my desks, right? So he's coming to their belief. And look down now, just, you can read it afterwards if you don't mind. I just don't want to go over by too much time. And look down in the bold. And in the bold, he says, and he goes on and he says to them, I don't want any but to have the power to oppress the masses of people so that everywhere during my reign you may have security of mind and in the enjoyment of peace may offer more fervent prayers for my reign to the Most High God, the Creator. He wants them to pray for him, who has deigned to crown me with his own immaculate right hand. For it is natural that men who are distracted by an anxiety should be hampered in spirit and should not have so much confidence in raising their hands to pray, but that those who are in respects free from care should rejoice with their whole hearts and offer their suppliant prayers on behalf of my imperial office to the mighty God. Right? What he's basically saying to them, you guys are struggling. The taxes are too high. You're being picked on because you are this minority religion, and especially now that the Christians are in charge, even though Christianity and Judaism are as different as they are today, way back historically. But he says you guys are being picked on because you're being picked on. You can't dream, you can't pray, you can't be who you are because you're too worried. A lot of Woody Allen jokes like that. I love this one. I'm sorry, I say it every time. Right? Woody Allen and Annie Hall, and Annie Hall says, "Oh, this is I know you can't quote Woody Allen anymore, but okay, so I'm sorry. But Annie Hall says, this is was passed down from my grandmother. This is this wonderful family heirloom." And Woody Hall says back to her, he says, "We don't have any family heirlooms. My grandmother was too busy being raped by Cossacks," right? If you know that line. So he's saying that in a nicer way, is what he's saying. Right? You guys, the Jews, and that's the Jews in Eastern Europe, didn't have time to dream big because we were too busy being abused and worrying about just basic survival. And he says to them, I don't want you to survive. I want you to pray. I want you to have strong religious lives. And in order to do that, I'm going to take the taxes away from you. And he continues and he says to them, at the end, he says, when I have successfully concluded the war with Persia, taking back of his empire, the Roman Empire is going to be great again. I may rebuild by my own efforts the sacred city of Jerusalem, which for so many years you have longed to see inhabited, and may bring settlers there, and together with you may glorify the Most High God therein. It's an amazing letter, and it's an amazing letter about Julian as this philosopher king. He's not just king. He's not just this victorious king and this great Roman Empire. He is a great philosopher. He has a great idea there, right? I want you, if you're not abused and you're not oppressed and you're not worried about survival, then you can be free men and you can dream and you can pray and you can live your life to the fullest, which we know is true. Now, it doesn't say it specifically in the letter, but it's reported later, and I'm not going to read it, I'll just talk about it. You can look in the source if that's okay. And in a Roman history, one of the great Roman history books, and we only have part of the book, is written by Amanius Marcellinus. I don't know if I pronounce his name right. He lives from about 330 to 400. He writes one of the great histories of the Roman Empire. Much of it has been lost to history. And I think from about 350 or so until 400 we have, which includes the reign of Julian. And in there, he talks about that Julian, he proposed, and I would say I'm quoting it, but obviously it's translated. He proposed to rebuild at vast expense the once magnificent Temple of Jerusalem. And this is in the year 363. We are living in the year 2024. Temple was destroyed in the year 70. That is a long time ago. This is 362. That's less than 300 years after the temple was destroyed. And here we have a Roman Empire, a Roman emperor who's ready to rebuild the temple. And Amanius continues and he describes that they started to do it. And there are great questions as to how much he does or he doesn't do. There are stories that he summons the rabbis to Rome to describe them and tell them what he wants to do and how he wants to rebuild the temple. It's not really discussed, fascinating, interestingly, it's not really discussed in Jewish sources. Were the Jews didn't believe it? Were their hopes not so high? Was it something that maybe they didn't want? It's not clear as to why. It's basically not described. But Julian proposes to rebuild the temple. The question of what happens is unclear. In some of the sources, it says, and again, some of the sources are written now. Here's the complexity. It's pretty much believed that Julian wants to rebuild the temple. It's pretty much believed that he even starts to rebuild the temple. What happens and to why, there are two possible reasons to why the temple is not rebuilt in the year 363. Things would have been a lot different if the temple had been rebuilt in the year 363, right? To just, I don't know what would have happened in the long run, but just, right, we think about today there is a mosque on the Temple Mount. If there was a temple built in the year 363, then in the year 700s or whatever, maybe there wouldn't be a mosque. Maybe it would have been destroyed, and then maybe there would be a mosque. Who knows? You can't know. If you read the histories of Jerusalem, at times Dome of the Rock was Muslim. When the Christians took over, it wasn't so Muslim anymore. So there are, historically things have reversed back and forth. But here we have this attempt. Julian contacts the Jews. He tells them he wants to rebuild the temple. Manius reports that he gets blueprints, he gets ready, he starts to rebuild the temple. They collect gold and silver, and people send in stuff, and he's getting ready. Why does he want to do it? Maybe because he hates the Christians. And together with that, how are you going to bother the Christians? Well, you're going to say the Jews are rebuilding the temple. And that's an insult to Christianity, because Christianity believes the temple was destroyed. We don't need a temple. Why do you need to bring? This is not everybody. I'm not talking for all of Christianity. Just one thought process. Christianity says Jesus was the Lamb, right? We don't need to bring sacrifices to God. You don't need a temple. We have Jesus. What's the point? You don't need a temple. So rebuilding the temple is an insult to the Christians, and he did not like their letters that he wrote to the Christians. They weren't as nice as the letters he wrote to the Jews. So that's one belief, is that's what he's doing. That's part of his cultic. And again, bring sacrifice. Christians don't bring animal sacrifices. The Jews used to bring back animal sacrifice. That's going to be cultic. That's going to be more pagan. That's going to bring us back to the ancient Greek and the Roman Empire, and that's going to bring us back to our glory. So those who say that's the reason why he was doing it. There are others who say, and not necessarily that one answer is right and one answer is wrong, that the reason is he's going to attack Persia, Babylon. What was there? There was a large minority in those countries, which there was until about 60 years ago, which was Jews. There were many Jews in Babylon. There were many Jews in Persia. We know, of course, the Talmud Bavli, right? The great Babylonian academies that were in Bavel, large amounts of Jews. And if he's going to attack the Persians, and I can't tell you the numbers. I have no idea. I don't know if it's known. Let's say it's, 10%. I know. If 10% of the population knows that this king who's coming in is going to be very friendly to us. So those who say historically what he was trying to do was win over the favor of the Jews. He wanted allies. He wanted spies. He wanted people who would be on his side when he was going into Persia to conquer the Persians and conquer the Babylonians and take that part of the empire. And that's why he did it. And it doesn't really matter which is the reason why, or if it's, usually things in life, it's not one reason, it's usually a combination of different elements before you do something like that. And that's his plan. And that's what he wants to do. Why doesn't it happen? So the main principal reason why it doesn't end up happening is in the year 361, he's killed in battle with the Persians. He's not very successful. He's known, by the way, historically as not just Julian, he's known as Julian the Apostate, which is the Christian description of him because he was an apostate to Christianity. And so in 361, he's killed. There's a belief amongst the Christian that it was almost like godly, that he was killed because he rebelled against Christianity. And when he's killed, this dream and this hope no longer continues, and the Jews are not given permission. They're not allowed anymore to go and to rebuild the temple. Like many things historically, right? The leader changes and the plans of one leader disappear, especially when we think about that his family and his successor are going to be more Christian, because that's who Constantine was, who was their who was their Saba Rabba, we'll call him. He was their, the grandfather, the in a sense, the patriarch of this part of the Roman empires and Roman leadership. And so it comes to an end at that time with his death. Now, there are different explanations. There's one other explanation that says as to why it doesn't happen, which is actually in this work of the Simonius, which is says that we know this for a fact. In 363, so as far as we can know facts, in 363 there was a great earthquake in the Galilee. There is, I do not know how they, I can't explain to you, right, based upon stones and dirt and different, right, how it's surmised that around that time, I don't know if you can surmise it to the exact date and the exact year, but along with historical records that identify, there is proof that at that time there were some great earthquakes. We know that in Turkey, not too far away from Israel, in Galilee, in different places, there are earthquakes that happen there, and there may have been tremors felt in Jerusalem, and there were some sort of fires, it's reported, that broke out. And so there are those who say that the building didn't really happen, but because of this earthquake, the stones were destroyed that they were using, and because of the earthquake and fires breaking out, and he reports that the workers were dying, and then they stopped refusing to work. And so that's another explanation as to why, and certainly along with his death, as to why the temple was not rebuilt in the year 361. Now, it's this interesting historical argument because just in terms of Julian, because Christian historians, and the way it was described for hundreds of years, you can imagine if the building of the Jewish temple is an insult to Christianity, all of a sudden godly earthquake and fires that break out, and the king is somehow killed while this is happening. He's killed in 363. I was going the years backwards. He's killed in 363, not 361. I was still in the before the Common Era time. My apologies for that. That it's seen by Christians as God saying to Julian and to the Roman emperor and the Roman Empire to not favor the Jews and go back to the way that Constantine has. So whatever way it happens or doesn't happen, it's this fascinating question to think about sort of what could have been. And, we can only speculate, and we can only think, and we can only, curious that here we have this king. And to me, that's the most fascinating one, who was ready to rebuild the temple, whatever the reasons were, whatever his reasons were, right? As Jews, we know many times as a minority population who has throughout our history basically been at the whim of larger empires and great kings and presidents and others. And we know, right, we are so dependent upon what they have to say and what they're going to tell us to do, and aren't very often able to make national decisions on our own. And that's been, a complexity of Jewish life. And it's a complexity, of course, a different type of complexity with the state of Israel today. But we were at the whim of these people and of these emperors. But to me, and maybe the most intriguing part of it all, of this last part, is that the Jews, it's really not reported. We know these sources from Julian. We know these sources from the Roman historians. We know these sources from Christian sources later. There really are not stories in the Talmud or in Talmudic literature about it. So are the Jews ambivalent to it? Is it just not written down because it's another disappointment? It looked like it was going to happen and it didn't, and it's just a disappointment, and it's another disappointment. How long are we going to have to wait till the temple is be rebuilt? And why do we want to get people's hopes up? So that's one possibility. There's another possibility that maybe the rabbis at that time were ambivalent about rebuilding the temple. I can't say, I don't know one way or the other. We know that one of the great figures of Jewish history is Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, who in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple, he goes and he figures out ways to make Judaism continue without the temple, without the Beit HaMikdash. And so have we moved away from that model? Did the rabbis say this is not the direction that we're going in? I don't know. I like to leave it as a question, something to consider, something to think about. And to me, it's just a very fascinating, intriguing historical event. All three of these kings, their relationships with Jerusalem, their relationships with the temple, and the temple being seen as sort of the sign and the symbol of the Jews and of the Jewish community from the time of Solomon as our great house, and how we have these different kings throughout our history who treated us very, very well through different times, and some of them real, some of them not real, some of them what could have been. And it's an intriguing, lesson to think about when we think about, again, as Shmuley said at the beginning, we think about power and we think about what is our relationship as Jews with larger power, as a minority population. What can we do? What can we accomplish? What can't we accomplish? And who are we going to, how are we going to do it? And so we have here, to me, the Julian episode is really this fascinating episode. And, coming back, let me just make a couple more comments with that. We know that Julian, and it's reported in these other sources, Julian was going against what Roman empires had done earlier. The Romans destroyed the temple in the year 70. The Romans in the year, I believe it's about 160 of Common Era, in the aftermath, 20 years later or 15 years later, after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, the Romans changed the name of the place from Judea to Palestine. They kicked the Jews out. It's not going to be called Jerusalem anymore. Excuse my Greek, Ialona, Capelita, or whatever. However it's called, the Jerusalem is renamed. They want to get rid of the Jews who have rebelled because the Jews want to hold on to their monotheistic religion. And here we have Julian hundreds of years later. At the same time that he's going back, he's actually in other ways going against what had been the prominent opinion of the Romans from around that time, with the destruction of the Jews and getting this little, we'll call the Jews and Judea a little thorn in their side. We weren't a huge poison ivy bush. We were a little thorn in their side, but he goes back and he wants to rebuild the temple. And so to me, it's just a fascinating historical event. And three kings and their relationship with our people, and what to think about today in terms of Judaism and power, and how we should assert ourselves and when to assert ourselves and when to be careful to not assert ourselves. So I'll leave it with that. If there are any questions from those of you on Zoom, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. I feel if you don't want to, that's okay also. I appreciate you coming out and spending the time with us. Today is more of a history lesson with intriguing, I think, things and questions about Jewish life. The next class that I will be giving, and I think it's here in Denver, it's going to be hosted locally at Temple Emmanuel. It's more of an afternoon class, I believe 3 p.m. next Tuesday. And if I remember properly, the topic is, I can't remember. I have to look back in my email. But so bad advertising. I'm always known for bad advertising. Biblical roots of anti-Semitism. So we'll look at something, unfortunately, something we know too well. We'll look at different stories in the Torah about anti-Semitism. You're invited to join if you'd like to. And a pleasure being here. Yes, please.
Did you say he was killed, Julian was killed in battle?
He was killed in battle against the Persians. It was a disastrous battle against the Persians, which also made it very easy for sort of the Romans to push under the rug everything that he wanted to do and everything that he was, because, right, ultimately, in many ways, kings and leaders are going to be judged based upon whether they keep peace, or if they are more warriors, if they're going to be victorious in battle. Did anybody have any questions or thoughts or comments? Yes, please.
Babylonians defeat Assyrians. Persians defeat Babylonians. Macedonians defeat Persians.
And we'll call the Macedonians Greeks.
Great. Greeks. You've got Rome now that comes. Now Rome is in decline.
So, yes.
So I'm lost in the place of, why are the Persians and the Babylonians significant if they have since been conquered? Granted, they might be
Have a resurgence or something.
a large
right. So right. I mean, when we talk about, let's say, the Babylonians, the Persians being defeated by the Greeks, by Alexander, that's in the year 330. So we're talking now 600 or 700 years later by the time we're talking about Julian. And remember that the Greek and then the Roman Empire was vast, right? Where at that certain point, it didn't make it all the way to India and different places of that sort, right? Going all the way from maybe the Alps all the way, down into Africa and all the way into Asia. And it's an impossible empire to control, right? And that's why after Alexander, for example, we have different Greek leaders leading in different places, Ptolemy and the Seleucid Greeks and Ptolemy, and right, and we have emperors in Constantine in Constantinople, and we have in Rome, and we have further to the east, and so they were always putting out fires. And sometimes those fires got very large,
Okay.
and sometimes they lost parts of their empire, and the attempts were to take back the empire. And so I appreciate the question. So, just like other episodes in Jewish history, like this amazing, in the Tanakh episode of Jewish history, when Sancherib, the Assyrian king, has 180,000 soldiers surrounding Jerusalem, and then they leave. And it's told, the description is that there's a great miracle that happens, and God makes Sancherib, who he says, you can see Jerusalem, but your arrow will never enter it. They leave, and they leave overnight, and there's some sort of massacre. Nobody knows what happens. But he also then, he goes because, and I forget exactly where, I think he travels north because somebody is rebelling. And maybe that's the reason they ran out so quickly. And he dies in that battle. So there always, when you have an empire that big, there are always fires that you are putting out. And so the big fire at that point was the Persians and the restoration of the eastern part of the empire. And much to the unfortunate and the fascinating thing, who knows where we would be sitting today if the temple was rebuilt, but it's not, because Julian is killed. So I appreciate the question. Hopefully some clarity in that answer.
Yeah.
Anybody else over there in Zoom land? If not, we will bid you adieu, and I thank you so much for joining me this evening, and hope that in the future we'll have time to study together. And if you have any questions that you don't want to ask now, and you want to ask later, please feel free to send it. Rav Shmuley, is my email address up on the VBM website? I don't know if you can hear me or not, but you contact them, they could put me in contact with you, and I'd love to hear more and get to know you more. So have a wonderful evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and looking forward to spending time together with you again in the future.